Hi, colleagues. My name is Timothy Krupnik, and I'm a systems agronomist and research scientist with the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center based in Bangladesh, but working across South and Southeast Asia with research responsibilities on fall armyworm. I'm apologizing as I begin this presentation that I can't join in person or at least virtually because of time constraints, but I am excited to make a presentation and record that for you, which I will show you now. The topic that I will address will be basically looking and thinking about issues related to the ecological management of fall armyworm in South and Southeast Asia's farming systems. So what I will go through is a quick background. I'll go through fundamentals of invasion biology, principles of ecological management, and thinking about them at different scales before I come to a conclusion. And I'd also like to say that much of the information that you will see in this presentation has been written up in a chapter in the guidebook, Fall Armyworm in Asia, a guide for integrated pest management that was published by CIMMYT and USAID earlier this year. And the 6th chapter of the book details in quite meticulous form a lot of these topics. So South and Southeast Asia are potential major hotspots for fall armyworm, and this map was produced courtesy of Cabby Biosciences several years ago, and I'm sure many of you have actually seen this map. But I'd like to point out that it reflects quite strongly our experience with the invasion of fall armyworm, but now the normalization of fall armyworm as a more common pest that we have within the region. It is important to note, though, that we are working in a high-risk region, and that has important implications for management. So why was fall armyworm a concern? Again, these are fundamental topics, but fall armyworm has numerous sinks. It's polyphagous. It can subsist on many different plants, although it has a high host association with maize. It has a high rate of fecundity, so it reproduces rapidly, large environmental and habitat suitability, as you saw in the previous slide, and has a very high range of dispersal, so it can move and migrate over very large distances. So when we think about those issues and bring in thinking about some of the key principles for agroecological management, we need to think about the pest itself. You need to think about its natural enemies, and you need to think about the environments in which they work together in. And so some of the principles of agroecological management as applied to fall armyworm would include improving soil health and crop nutrition, integrating biodiversity when and where appropriate to support habitat for natural enemies, management of crops to reduce pest outbreak and reduce the impact of the pest, and to avoid the use of pesticides that can kill natural enemies and cause pest resurgence. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that pesticides are always prohibited from management and systems, but they should not be a first resort. Oops, sorry. So again, fall armyworm entered the region quite some time ago, and what you see on this graph is a generalized graph of an invasion biology curve for most invasive species. You see this early establishment period, which is followed by a rapid rate of growth, and then you see an establishment of populations. And then over time, you see that the pest typically becomes resident with fluctuation throughout the seasons as pests develop their natural enemy communities that interact with them. You will see this kind of fluctuation. And I think this is important because in many cases, I think fall armyworm, from what we see in the evidence, is starting to normalize within at least South Asia and parts of Southeast Asia. It is a problem in some locations in some years, but not in all years. And that is because of these sort of establishment dynamics, which have implications for management. Also important to think about when thinking about agroecological management of fall armyworm is the interdependencies and implications for pest management at multiple scales. We should not be thinking only about the field scale, but rather be thinking about the collection of fields at a community level, within a village and a particular farming landscape, and also at larger meso landscapes, as you see here. So one must integrate thinking about the crop, the field margins, the landscape, the meso landscape, and so on throughout thinking on how to manage fall armyworm. So we're thinking about the dynamics in which the pest and its natural enemies will interact at a landscape level. And why that's important will come up more in just a few moments. So I will go through these different scales in the presentation, starting from crop scale to field margins, landscape scale, and then I'll talk about integrated pest management toolboxes before I conclude. At the crop scale, there are plant-based mechanisms that will be important. Natural enemies can be attracted to volatiles, for example, that are emitted from maize when maize is attacked by pests such as fall armyworm. And that's important because we want to assure that where you have challenges with pests that you are attracting natural enemies. Although this is not something that's been typically thought of or brought into breeding programs, it is a potentially important consideration for more ecological approaches. How can we, for example, find mechanisms and ways that the host plant can actually, for example, call out for help through increased expression of volatiles if attacked? There are other considerations that can be brought into breeding. For example, the need to consider trichomes, or the hairs on leaves, leaf waxiness, and so on. There's only been recent efforts and recent successes in Africa around developing maize that is tolerant to fall armyworm in various ways. And we do need to accelerate similar work to that in Asia as well. It's also important to note that maize as a plant has a compensation ability. Really, maize as a grass will be able to come back from quite considerable amounts of damage that are inflicted upon it at the younger vegetative stage. But it's really damage within the whorl in the center of the maize plant that can be a significant problem with respect to fall armyworm. Many people also point to genetic engineering and the use of GMOs as a tool and technique in pest management. And to be honest, in some cases, this might be a potentially useful tool. BT, or Bacillus thuringiensis modified maize, is a very common thing that is found in the Americas, where it is used partially to manage fall armyworm amongst other pests. Although we have seen in the literature problems with the development of resistance to Bacillus thuringiensis with GM crops. And that's an important point to note, because GM crops or otherwise will never be a silver bullet. Once again, crops such as this need to be taken in the context of an overall integrated pest management plan, which will include other options that might be in addition to or in replacement to genetic modification. There are, however, currently no major options within Asia for BT crops, exempting, I believe, if I understand correctly, perhaps the Philippines, and I believe there has been some work also in mainland Southeast Asia around BT maize. But for the vast majority of farmers within the region, they will focus rather instead on management. And this is, again, where the agroecological interactions that I talked about really come into play. Important issues around agroecological management and agronomic management include, for example, tillage. In temperate environments, inversion tillage is recommended as a long-term strategy for management of fall armyworm because it pupates within the soil. And inverting the soil can damage the pupae and ideally, in theory, reduce overall area-wide populations. However, there's also evidence that zero tillage, in which residue from the previous crop is left on the surface, and also reduced tillage, can also reduce fall armyworm incidence. And this came from research literature that was done decades ago. Reduced in disturbance of the soil and the maintenance of a mulch creates habitat for predators, especially beetles, carabidae beetles, spiders, and ants, and other predators that can predate upon fall armyworm larvae itself if they forage into the crop, and or also pupae that are on the soil surface. Zero tillage may also be a physical barrier, or the mulch that can be within between maize plants when they have just become established may also be a physical barrier for late instar larvae that are ballooning, which is when the larvae emits a silken strand, and that they are taken by wind, and that allows them to swing from maize plant to maize plant. This is the mechanism of plant to plant dispersion for larvae. And if you have interference by either a living or a dead mulch or an intercrop, for example, that is between the two, depending on the type of intercrop, then you may have an interruption of that movement between maize plant to maize plant. However, it depends. There's evidence that a colleague, Badrun et al., working in Zimbabwe, found, for example, that some intercrops may be more effective than others, and in fact, some intercrop species may actually facilitate movement. So to make a long story short, when it comes to this level of agronomic management, more research is actually needed. Farmers and extension agents need to be able to carefully advise farmers on what is appropriate based upon available evidence in scientific literature, although in principle, the goal of interrupting the potential movement of larvae from plant to plant and reduction in tillage to create habitat for natural enemies makes considerable sense. Also, thinking about agronomic management is thinking about excessive nitrogen use, where farmers are using too much nitrogen, particularly if they apply foliar nitrogen or late season nitrogen. This could attract an increased number of herbivores. Conversely, again, coming back to the point about reduced tillage and efforts that might, for example, increase or maintain soil organic matter in fields, there have been observations previously of lower herbivore and higher predator populations and higher organic matter soils. So these need to be brought into the mix around consideration of longer-term management strategies and tillage. Weeds and weeding. Of course, fall armyworm being polyphagous, one would want to remove gramineaceous or grass species that are also within or on field margins that could act as alternative hosts for fall armyworm larvae. There's also been some research that has been done that looks at the effects of manual weeding through the agitation of soil when maize perhaps is earthed up that could also kill pupae that are pupating within the soil. And also mechanisms, as I mentioned, that weeds can act as a physical barrier and interrupt the dispersal of early instar ballooning between maize plant to maize plant, and thus reduce potentially the effect of fall armyworm dispersal within fields. Lastly, I'd like to think about irrigation and flooding. There has been work that has come out that has pointed out that irrigation can be utilized to potentially, in irrigated systems within South and Southeast Asia, if you flood a field, that can essentially physically drown and cause mortality for pupating larvae. This has not been confirmed, however, according to research that I've actually seen, although once again, it makes some degree of sense and is a worthwhile hypothesis to test. However, it's also important to note that this mechanism is unlikely to help a particular farmer, but instead may be a useful mechanism for reducing area-wide or landscape scale or even larger fall armyworm populations. But because fall armyworm, after it emerges from its pupal form and moves into its moth-based form, it moves up and then is usually pushed away by the wind. You will not see an effect within a particular single field of flood irrigation on reducing population of fall armyworm. However, there may be interactions between appropriate water management and assuring that the crop has enough water to grow to its best ability and produce biomass that could also interact and help reduce the effect of fall armyworm feeding on maize itself. Again, at the field scale, it's important to think about natural enemies, and these can be both arthropod insect natural enemies. There's more than 150 parasitoids from 15 families, including Diptera, Hymenoptera, and even nematodes that contribute to efforts around conservation biological control, or can be used in terms of augmentative releases for control of a range for fall armyworm by a range of species. Good research has been done to characterize those different species and their population levels in different countries of Asia over the last few years. Also often recommended is the management of field margins and within fields by the intercropping or field margin planting of flowering plants that may attract nectar-seeking parasitoids that may also work to control fall armyworm. But again, this evidence within Asia is relatively limited, and studies that have worked on this have looked at these principles in other countries. Also important are vertebrate predators, and are rarely but thought about, but are important in management of fall armyworm at a larger scale. And that would include literature that has come around on the role of bats in controlling fall armyworm, which is very interesting and important as a large-scale conservation strategy, but also predation by some bird species as well. Intercropping is often proposed as an agroecological method for management of a range of pest species, including fall armyworm. And what we have seen to some extent is that fall armyworm attack appears to be higher in areas with intensive maize monoculture. And this is evidence from climatically similar locations in other countries and regions that are similar to Asia. And the environments and ecosystems that would be of interest to this group. Intercrops, as with zero tillage mulches and/or particular weeds, as I mentioned, may also disrupt larval phototaxis, which is the dispersal of early instar larvae from host plant to host plant by creating a physical barrier for larvae that are ballooning and moving from plant to plant. Work has been done on that many years ago, and it is a principle that makes a lot of sense, although, as I indicated by the studies that had been done in Zimbabwe, it is important to carefully consider the intercrop species when choosing which intercrop to plant. Some species that have a more continuous intercrop canopy would allow fall armyworm to also walk and/or potentially move across maize rows and move from plant to plant and thus disperse within the field. Whereas from a management principle, you would actually want an intercrop that is difficult in terms of its architecture for fall armyworm to move across, that creates either a physical barrier for phototaxis or just simply makes a challenge for movement of larvae from plant to plant, because you have a very, how should I say, tortuous or difficult to transverse and move across crop canopy. Intercrops have also been shown to reduce fall armyworm oviposition. And this might be due to olfactory disruption of female fall armyworms seeking host plants to oviposit on. But again, one last point is that intercrops require careful design to avoid potential trade-offs. And more of that is detailed within the chapter that I mentioned earlier. Often considered also and proposed are push-pull systems. These, of course, are quite widely utilized in Africa, and I believe have probably been discussed by this group before, where you, for example, plant a push crop. So maize, for example, might be intercropped with a Desmodium species to push natural enemies and others into a crop area, while you may have a pull crop that attracts the pest, in this case fall armyworm, to a border. For example, Napier grass has been proposed as a mechanism to do this. And there's been quite some work that's been done on this in Africa that has indicated considerable reductions in damage and higher yields that result from intercropping and management of fall armyworm. There are research efforts that look at this system within Asia, but I also have to say one thing that does concern me about push-pull systems are that we are asking farmers to do something that is very, very different. Where these systems work in practice, it may be very difficult to get farmers to adopt them at a large scale simply because of the complexity of management and the additional labor requirements that are an important concern in Asia that may make it more challenging for farmers to adopt complex push-pull configurations. However, I would encourage those who are interested in this to read more in the chapter that I mentioned, where we discuss in more detail the trade-offs, the benefits, and the constraints associated with push-pull systems. In management of fall armyworm, we want to ideally reduce the negative effects associated with pesticides. And this could include encouraging the development of pesticide resistance, which is an important issue for multiple pests, not only fall armyworm, as you see here, or pest resurgence, whereby the application of broad spectrum pesticides kill natural enemies as well as the pest itself, but allow more rapidly multiplying pests to resurge and come back within the crop more quickly than natural enemies themselves. And in order to reduce unnecessary pesticide use, what we've been doing, for example, at least in Bangladesh and other countries have picked this up. This approach, for example, has been utilized also in Laos, PDR recently, through partner organizations that we have worked with. But essentially is the approach of scouting the field and looking for a very basic indicator of the amount of fall armyworm damage and the population of fall armyworm present through using pheromone traps to make informed, very simple spray, no spray decisions. And this is much simpler than complex economic threshold calculations that are often put into place, but are designed to really give something that's actionable and simple and easy to use for even smallholder farmers that may not have the best, for example, computational skills to be able to really go into detailed management strategies around economic thresholds. Moving from the field scale, I'd like to talk about field margins now. There has been work that has looked at the potential role of live fences, windbreaks, and hedgerows, or essentially farm and field scale biodiversity to provide field-to-field connectivity for natural enemies. So the idea that at a larger scale that multiple fields may need to have habitat that would allow natural enemies to move between fields, thereby benefiting multiple farmers or multiple fields owned by the same farmer. This also could theoretically, to some extent, limit fall armyworm dispersal by ballooning if you have, for example, breaks between fields, natural habitat barriers between fields, planting of alternative crops that are between fields that would limit movement from one field to the other, and maize plant in adjacent fields where fall armyworm are ballooning and moving from plant to plant. But again, this has not in Asia yet been demonstrated really conclusively and remains a research hypothesis, but a plausible one. Work has also been done to integrate agroforestry and trees as habitat, for example, creating nest sites for insectivorous birds, bats, and generalist natural enemies that may have benefits with respect to fall armyworm control, but may also have trade-offs where they may introduce particular types of pests and predators as well. So again, one must approach the management of biodiversity very carefully. There has been recent research, for example, that's found that at landscape levels, the results are somewhat idiosyncratic. At times there are benefits from management of landscapes, at times there are not. And what we also know within Asia that no specific research has examined, to my knowledge to date, within field or field edge agroforestry effects and management of fall armyworm. So that remains an area that would be important to look at. Landscape complexity and agroecological management of fall armyworm is also an important, as we've moved from crop to field scale to talk about fields and between field interactions, now thinking about landscape scales. You see the very different, large differences that we see in landscapes, for example, where you see satellite images here of a 1.5 square kilometer area in the United States. That's a single farm. Or in Zimbabwe, where you see large collections of multiple farms, or moving to Nepal in areas that I've worked on fall armyworm a little bit in Nepal, where you see multiple fields, but also the interspersion of agroforestry and habitat, as I just discussed. There are numerous studies that show positive correlations between landscape complexity, the maintenance of forest patches, and natural enemies. However, the results can at times be idiosyncratic. Just recently, a paper was published in PNAS that looked at global data sets and concluded that, again, at least for predators and natural habitat, the results depend on a variety of factors. So once again, landscape planning and reliance on landscape for management of fall armyworm needs to be considered very carefully. And also very early work done on fall armyworm indicated, quite some 20, 30 years ago, indeed, that the results were not always consistent. Research is needed, though, within Asia's specific farming systems, and there may also be effects of seasonality in Asia, particularly in South Asia, where maize, for example, may be grown in multiple seasons, and in both the winter season with irrigation and during the summer monsoon season. The ways in which these things interact with landscapes are not currently well known or studied, although the chapter that I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation does have some practical advice for landscape management and thinking about landscape design. One way, shape, or form, though, however one wants to proceed, this will require community engagement with farmers and careful policy and community and village level planning, because we're talking about collective action strategies that would be put into place for large-scale management of pests. And while this idea is beautiful, in practice, it can often be quite difficult to achieve. So coming towards my conclusions, I'd like to conclude by saying I've spoken just about some ideas for agroecological management approaches. We've talked about invasion biology, principles of ecological management. At the crop scale, we've talked about host plants and host plant resistance and management of host plants. At the field scale, we've talked about tillage, we've talked about irrigation, we've talked about nutrient management and management to encourage pest suppression by natural enemies. At the field margin scale, we've talked about movement of pests between fields and what can be done to disrupt that. And we've also scaled that up and talked a little bit about the implications at the landscape scale. But these are just some particular tools that need to be included within an overall integrated pest management and ecological pest management toolbox. Just agroecological management may not always be appropriate in all locations, times, and so on. We really need to integrate the best principles from agroecological management around biological pest control, the use of biorational pesticides when and where they might be needed, particular efforts that might come into place on host plant resistance, where currently there are considerable efforts being put into place around conventional breeding programs to improve the resistance of maize to and tolerance of maize to fall armyworm. Cultural control and habitat management has been a big part of what I've talked about in this presentation and will remain an important strategy for the management of fall armyworm. So to conclude, I want to thank everybody for listening to the presentation. I again apologize that I can't be there to take questions, but I wanted to leave my email so you could send me questions should you have them. And I understand also that our colleagues who are managing today's seminar will also note questions and send them to me, and I will try to get back to you if you have additional questions. But I want to say once again, thank you for listening, and bye-bye.